Some apologies don't begin with the words, "I'm sorry." They begin much earlier, with a quiet realization that there was something we should have said years ago. Not because we didn't love someone. Sometimes because we believed they already knew. When we're young, we imagine apologies belong to moments of anger, arguments, mistakes, broken promises. The older I get, the more I believe the hardest apologies are different. They aren't about something we did. They're about something we never gave. A sentence, a hug, a few simple words that stayed in our hearts far longer than they should have. A man named Robert shared this story with me one autumn evening. He had recently turned 72, retired after almost 40 years as a high school history teacher. If you met him, you'd probably think of him as dependable, always early, always prepared, the kind of father who never missed a school concert, never forgot a birthday, never let his family wonder whether the bills would be paid. He loved quietly, steadily, the way many men of his generation learned to. Robert often told me, "My father wasn't a man of many words." Then he'd smile. I guess I became a little too much like him. One rainy afternoon, Robert opened the top drawer of the desk in his study. He wasn't looking for anything important, just a fresh pen. Instead, his hand brushed against a small wooden box, tucked into the back corner. He hadn't opened it in years. The wood had darkened with age. Tiny scratches covered the lid. He smiled the moment he saw it. "I forgot this was here." He carried the box to the window, sat down in the old leather chair beside it, and slowly lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in a soft handkerchief, was an old wristwatch, round face, brown leather strap, the kind of watch people repaired instead of replacing. Robert picked it up carefully, turned the crown once, then another. A few seconds later, the familiar ticking returned, soft, steady, patient, almost as if it had simply been waiting. He held the watch in his palm for a long time, then looked out through the rain-speckled window. "I think it's time." He whispered the words so quietly, they almost disappeared beneath the sound of the rain. At that moment, I wasn't sure whether he was talking about the watch or something else entirely. Robert told me the watch had belonged to his father. On the day Robert graduated from college, his father placed it in his hand and said, "One day, you'll give this to your own son." Nothing more, no long speech, no life lesson, just those few words. Years later, when David graduated, Robert did exactly what his father had done. He handed his son the watch, smiled, and said, "I've been waiting a long time to give you this." David thanked him, put the watch on his wrist, and hugged his father. It was a good day, a day Robert remembered fondly. For years, he believed that moment had said everything that needed to be said. It wasn't until much later that he began wondering whether it had. One evening, not long before his 72nd birthday, Robert was helping his grandson with a history project. The boy couldn't have been older than 11. At one point, he looked up from his notebook and asked, "Grandpa, were you proud of Dad when he was my age?" Robert smiled immediately, more than you could imagine. The boy nodded, went back to writing. Then, almost absent-mindedly, he said, "I don't think Dad knows that." Robert felt something inside him become very still. He looked at his grandson. "What makes you say that?" The boy shrugged. "I've never heard you tell him." For a long moment, Robert didn't answer, because he was no longer sitting at the kitchen table with his grandson. He was somewhere else, remembering 43 years of conversations, birthdays, graduations, baseball games, family dinners, phone calls, holiday mornings, trying to remember whether he had ever actually said the words. And the longer he searched, the quieter the room seemed to become. Robert told me he kept thinking about what his grandson had said, not because it was painful, because it was possible. For days, he found himself replaying ordinary moments from the past, driving David to baseball practice, helping him with homework at the kitchen table, teaching him how to shave, watching him walk across the stage at graduation. There were hundreds of memories, maybe thousands. In every one of them, Robert remembered feeling proud. The strange part was, he couldn't remember saying it. One afternoon, he pulled an old photo album from the bookshelf. It had become harder to lift. Then he remembered. Age has a way of making even familiar things feel heavier. He smiled as he turned the pages. David at 6, missing his 2 front teeth. David at 13, holding up a fishing rod, almost taller than he was. David on his wedding day. There it was again, that feeling. Pride, quiet, constant, almost overwhelming. Robert ran his fingers gently across the photographs, then whispered to himself, "I hope you knew." The words hung in the room for a long time. That evening, his wife found him sitting in the living room, with the album still open. "You've been looking at those pictures for nearly an hour." Robert smiled without looking up. "I have." She sat beside him. Neither of them spoke for a while. After 48 years of marriage, they had become very good at sharing silence. Finally, Robert asked, "Do you think David knows how proud I am of him?" His wife didn't answer immediately. She thought about the question, not because she didn't know, because she wanted to answer it honestly. "I think he knows you love him." Robert nodded. "But that's not what I asked." She looked at him. "No, it isn't." Another quiet moment passed. Then she reached over, closed the photo album gently, and rested her hand on top of it. "You've spent your whole life showing him." She smiled. "Maybe now it's time to tell him." Robert laughed softly. "You make it sound easy." She smiled back. "It isn't. If it were, you would have done it years ago." He looked out the window. Rain had started falling again. Slow, steady. Very much like the afternoon he'd found the old watch. "You know what worries me?" he asked. His wife shook her head. "What if it feels awkward?" She smiled. "Robert, when has awkward ever been a good reason? Not to tell someone you love them?" He couldn't help laughing. She had a way of asking simple questions that were surprisingly difficult to answer. The following Sunday, David came over for dinner with his family. It was the kind of evening they'd shared dozens of times before. The grandchildren ran through the backyard. Someone accidentally spilled lemonade. Everyone laughed. The smell of roasted chicken filled the kitchen. Nothing unusual happened. And somehow, that made everything feel even harder. Robert kept thinking, "I'll tell him after dinner. Then, maybe when everyone leaves. Then, perhaps next Sunday." The words found another reason to wait, just as they always had. After dessert, David walked into the garage to help his father carry in a folding table. The two of them lifted it together, just as they had done every Thanksgiving for years. Halfway across the garage, David smiled. "We've gotten pretty good at this." Robert laughed. "I suppose we have." They set the table against the wall. Neither man moved right away. The garage grew quiet. Outside, the grandchildren were laughing somewhere in the yard. Robert looked at his son, then looked away again. For a brief moment, he almost let the opportunity pass. Again. But this time, something felt different. Not urgent. Not dramatic. Just too important to postpone. One more time. Robert stood in the garage for another moment. The folding table leaned quietly against the wall. From the backyard, he could hear his grandchildren laughing. Someone called for more lemonade. A screen door opened. then closed again. Life was moving on, just as it always did. Robert looked at his son, then took a slow breath. David. His voice sounded different, quieter. David turned. Yeah, Dad? Robert rubbed his hands together, a habit he'd had for years, whenever he was trying to find the right words. There's something I've been meaning to tell you. David waited. No rush, no interruption. Robert smiled awkwardly. You know, I always thought you knew. David tilted his head slightly. Knew what? Robert looked down at the concrete floor. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't a father trying to have the right answer. He was simply a man trying to tell the truth. I've been proud of you. And for a very long time. His voice caught for just a moment, probably longer than you realize. The garage became very still. Robert let out a small laugh. I guess I just wasn't very good at saying it. David didn't answer immediately. He looked at his father, as though he were hearing a familiar voice say something completely new. After a long moment, he smiled, a quiet smile, the kind that carries more relief than surprise. I hoped. Robert looked up. David continued. I really did. He slipped one hand into his pocket. But I still wanted to hear it. Those words settled gently between them, not like an accusation, more like the truth, finally finding its place. Robert nodded slowly. I know. He took another breath. There's something else. I think I owe you an apology. David frowned a little. For what? Robert looked toward the backyard, watching his grandchildren run across the grass. I spent so many years trying to be responsible that I forgot to be expressive. I thought working hard, being there, taking care of everything. I'd tell you everything you needed to know. He smiled sadly. It should have. But maybe it wasn't fair to make you guess. David looked at his father for a long moment. Then he stepped closer. You know what I remember most? Robert shook his head. I remember you teaching me how to ride a bike. I remember you sitting through every baseball game. I remember you staying up all night, helping me finish my science project. He smiled. I never questioned whether you loved me. Robert's shoulders relaxed a little. David continued. But every little boy wants to hear his dad say he's proud of him. Another quiet silence. This one felt lighter, not because the years had disappeared, because they no longer stood between them. Robert reached into his pocket. He pulled out the old wristwatch. Its leather strap had softened over time. The glass carried tiny scratches that only appeared when the light caught it. He turned it over once in his hand, then placed it gently into David's palm. My father gave this to me. I gave it to you. He smiled. But I left something out. David looked at him. Robert's eyes were warm now, steady, certain. So let me give it to you now. He rested his hand lightly on his son's shoulder. I'm proud of the man you became. Not because of your job. Not because of what you've accomplished. I'm proud of the way you love your family. The way your children run to you. The way people feel safe around you. He smiled. I don't think a father gets to ask for much more than that. David's eyes filled, but he smiled before anything could fall. He gave a small laugh. You know, I've been waiting a long time to hear that. Robert smiled back. I know. I guess I've kept you waiting long enough. Without another word, David stepped forward. The two men embraced. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't the kind of hug that erased 40 years. It was something quieter. A hug that simply said, we don't have to leave this unsaid anymore. That evening, after everyone had gone home, Robert returned to his study. The rain had stopped. The house was peaceful. He opened the wooden box again. Only this time, it was empty. He smiled, closed the lid, and for the first time in many years, the ticking he noticed most wasn't coming from the old watch. It was the quiet feeling that time had not run out after all. Fireside reflection. As we grow older, we often assume the people we love already know how we feel. Maybe they do, but love has never been measured only by what we carry in our hearts. Sometimes, it's measured by what we're willing to say out loud. There are words that change very little, and there are words that arrive years late, yet somehow, right on time. If someone came to your mind while you were listening tonight, don't wait for the perfect moment. It rarely arrives. A simple sentence, spoken with honesty, is often enough. Thank you for spending this evening with me. I'll see you again next time.